I'm Nicole, by the way. Hi. I invited you all to the meeting, just to let you know. So there's once it's your time to finish speaking, that's when I just ask that you turn your microphone and your camera off. But until then, I think you guys are all for the applicant anyway. So you guys are up first.
Thanks for that, Nicole.
No worries.
Are we jumping into it now, Nicole, or do we wait for the commissioners?
Wait for the commissioner. So we've got Joe
Probably need them.
there. Joe, are you able to just turn your camera off, please? Thank you.
Do you want to stop it?
Yeah, just off one
Okay, shut this one down.
if you need that.
I to get underway, but I'm just waiting for Councillor McPherson to join. Would be quite handy. So I've got a full panel.
We've just had Mr. and Mrs. Hankinson, you're able to leave your camera on if you like, because you're the applicant.
Nicole, have you heard from Martin?
No, nothing, but I can give him a call.
I might pay to wake him up.
Martin, request to join.
Good thinking.
He might have thought it was 11:30, not 11:20.
It's trouble when you get old. Oh, sorry, Mr. Todd, I wasn't referring that to you.
Cool, he's on now.
There he is. He's there now. Cool, thank you. You with us, Martin? Excellent. Right, good morning, everybody. We are reconvening the meeting of the Central Otago District Council Hearings Panel, and the next agenda item for us to consider is 22.3.3, which is an application for resource consent RC 210313. A bit of formality I need to go through first, so just bear with me while I do that, please. This is a properly convened meeting of the Hearings Panel called for the purpose of hearing submission in relation to a resource application to... I've lost the page. For a two-lot rural subdivision, sorry. Yeah, found it again. At 50 Henny Road, Lowburn. I'd ask the Minute Secretary to report on proceedings to date.
All statutory requirements under Section 95 of the Resource Management Act have been complied with. Report of the planning consultant has been circulated to the address for service, and the submissions received have been identified in the report.
Thank you. The following procedure will be followed for the hearing. The panel of officers may ask questions. Council's officers or its consultants shall put any questions through the chair, and the chair shall be deemed to be the person asking the questions. The applicant or the applicant's representative shall make submissions and present evidence. The submitters or their representatives shall then make submissions and present evidence. The planning consultant shall then make their submission. The applicant shall have the right to reply, but shall not be permitted to again traverse the evidence nor raise new evidence. So before proceeding with the hearing, I'd ask that all parties appearing identify themselves, and I'm just going to just do that myself because we're doing this by the Teams platform. So I'm sorry for having to do it this way. It's not the best way, but it does work. I'm sure everybody understands and appreciates why we are doing it this way. So, Mr. Woodward, I see that I've got you there, and I guess you're leading the applicant's part of the process, and I'm expecting that you were joined by Graham Todd, who I can see there as well. Todd.
Thank you.
And Mr. and Mrs. Hankinson, there they go there. Yep. So I can see you guys there. Otherwise, I'm just looking through my list to see who I'm missing. I'm expecting Roger de Groo to Be online as well. Are you there, Roger? No. Hugh Murray, is he joining us?
Commissioner Gillespie, I've got Hugh Murray basically standing by on the phone. So if we've got any question for Hugh, we can bring him into the hearing. Cool,
thank you. Sorry about that. Just had to shut the window. My father decides that's a good day to mow the lawns outside my window while I'm doing a hearing. Thanks, Dad. Nikki Lord, are you online? Nikki, you're down to be appearing as a submitter. No. Rightio. Have I missed anybody?
Got Joe Nothing sitting there. He's the landscape architect.
Ah, yes. So that's Joe, part of your team, Jake?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. And Jeremy Callender, I have down as a submitter as well. Jeremy, are you there? Okay. So Jeremy, Nikki, and Roger are not there. So if they do join, Nicole, would you just look out for me in case I miss it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, thank you. And obviously, we've got Morgan Ramsey online, who's the consultant planner of the 42A report. And I think otherwise the rest of our CODC staff that are part of our process. So welcome, everybody. I was going to say something really important that's just slipped my mind before we got underway. Yeah, no, well, it'll come to me and I'll bring it up. Oh, sorry. I do need to, the panel does need to consider the late submission that has been received, and the recommendation is that we accept that late submission. So to enable that submitter to speak and for that submission to be considered, I will seek from the panel a recommendation that we accept that late submission.
I'm happy to move.
Seconded. I'm sorry, and I'm making the assumption from the applicant that there is no issue with that.
This is the submission received from Mr. Roger de Groot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that submission was received on Christmas Day, day before Christmas.
The exact day.
The matters raised in that submission, Commissioner, are reasonably consistent with some of the other matters that were raised. So there's no issues with being able to consider those matters.
Yeah, cool. I thought that would be your situation. You had me worried for a minute. You're going to tell me why you didn't want to, and I thought that'll be an interesting conversation we're about to have. Right. So on that basis, move the second, and all those in favour, aye. So that's carried. Thank you. And Mr. Woodward, I hand over you to bring the case for the applicant. Now we have received the evidence, and let me just check here for a moment, make sure I can tell you what we have got. So we've got the Harris versus CODC case. We've got the revised scheme plan. We've got your evidence, and Mr. Murray's, Mr. Nothing's, and the Hankinson evidence. Is there anything else we're missing from there?
No, that's pretty much everything.
Cool.
Commissioner.
So the panel have had a chance to review that, and as I'm sure you won't be surprised, we do not require it to be read word for word. I'm sure that the submitters can give us their summary and the important parts they want to make sure that we remember. We will possibly and probably have some questions as we go through, but I'll leave that to you.
For sure. No, hey, thanks for that, and yeah, appreciate everyone's time. I suppose just a bit of administration really. The scheme plan that I sent through direct to council yesterday, that it's not an updated scheme plan. It's really just to make sure that we're all looking at the same one. Yep. So just by way of background for the benefit of the commission, the application as originally submitted in August last year, it included a scheme plan that had an outdated aerial photograph. Several days after we submitted the application, I simply sent through an updated aerial photograph on the scheme plan. That same scheme plan was utilised in Council Section 42A report, which is great. But I suppose there's perhaps some confusion around the extent to which the engineering report, Council's engineering report, was fully aware of the nature of the building being existing. Particularly, we'll see later on that some of the conditions refer to matters around finished floor levels, which practically speaking, seem I guess, a little bit illogical in this case. But yeah, they just seem to be, just want to make sure that everyone is actually looking at the same scheme plan really, which was sent out yesterday. Otherwise, yeah, look, I suppose condensing the issue down to the key matters, there seems to be, at least from my reading of the council's recommending report and the submission, there's two key matters I think that are at play here. The first one is this idea of adverse effects being generated in terms of rural amenity values with the subdivision, and then this idea of the extent to which the subdivision potentially promoting a precedent effect. And we've got advice from, or at least assistance from Mr. Todd in that regard around precedent. But I suppose just briefly summarising the issue around rural amenity, as a starting point, I suppose it's important to recognise that there are no physical changes being promoted as part of the subdivision. The subdivision does effectively, everything's in place. The building has a code of compliance, servicing is all in place. Effectively, the proposal seeks to repurpose that building and to incorporate a new internal boundary. That would effectively result in two lots, one of 1.8 hectares and one of just under 1.1 hectares. The existing building has already gone through a rigorous consenting process. In fact, it was subject to notification and it was subsequently approved, and it appears on site as of today. In terms of the council recommending report, that I suppose the key issues that I've picked up here is this idea of the subdivision in of itself undermining, I guess, the rural qualities of the rural resource area. And I suppose I'm just sort of trying to understand where council are coming from in that regard, particularly recognising that I suppose as a starting point, I mean, the rural resource area itself is a very it's a very substantial zone in our district. It's outside of our urban centres in our settlement zone. The rural resource area covers much of our district, and within that particular zone in of itself, there's just a significant variability in terms of land uses, in terms of no two land parcels can generally be considered exactly the same. I mean, the variability extends from the extent of built form to the degree of open space, all the way through to things like the types of soils and their ability to access irrigation water and so on. So within the rural resource area itself, there's a significant variation in terms of land uses. And I think when we think about the district plan and how they apply the density criteria of this notion of a minimum of 2 hectares, the Commission just needs to be aware, and I'm sure you are aware, that this idea of the minimum allotment size is only one tool in terms of determining whether or not the subdivision is appropriate. So recognising that the rural resource area has a high degree of variation in terms of land uses, you only have to drive down Lowburn Valley Road, Heaney Road, Burn Cottage Road to appreciate what that character might be, or what that character actually is, as it appears today. Yes, it's zoned rural resource area, but there's certainly a high degree of domestication that occurs in the lower portions or the lower reaches of the valley itself. It's a character that's been at least observed by myself in preparing the application, and subsequently we've sought advice from Mr. Joe Nutting, who resides in the area, but he's certainly provided us with some confirmation, if you like, in terms of that character. But simply because the site is zoned rural resource area doesn't automatically suggest that residential isn't appropriate. The size of the subdivision, yes, it certainly doesn't comply with the 2 hectares, but the 2 hectares is a trigger, isn't it? It's a trigger to determine whether or not the effects of that subdivision are appropriate in this location. So summarising where we've got to, the building itself, it's existing, it's been determined as being appropriate in that setting, it's been determined as not compromising from open space values. It's been determined that the building sits within an enclave of existing residential activities. It's been determined that that character of the Lowburn Valley itself is one that is characterised by a range of different densities, residential character, co-located in amongst some existing vineyards. but to suggest that the proposal is detracting from the rural character, the rural amenity value, doesn't appropriately implement the policies for that zone. It specifically requires us to consider those effects, and so I've come to the conclusion that the effects are effectively unchanged as a result of the subdivision. The proposal doesn't compromise any further productive capacity, which has been determined to be, to a degree, non-existent. No irrigation water would support any, or rather the site doesn't have access to I guess, a reliable source of irrigation water for some degree of intensive horticulture. From a partial perspective, we've got advice to determine that productive capacity isn't necessarily viable. Certainly, I wouldn't think it would be a logical decision for someone to make to come and buy this block with the intent of living off it. Again, the rural resource area does have areas which can absorb residential activity. So for those reasons, yeah, I don't share the same opinion as that of the recommending report. Certainly, it needs to be taken on. It needs to be taken on in terms of the context, or the consideration of the subdivision need to be considered in the context of the receiving environment, which you would have seen as you've done your site visit. Certainly doesn't have the open space, large paddocks and intensive productive use as seen elsewhere in other areas of the rural resource area. So simply picking this up and putting it somewhere else, it doesn't necessarily suggest that it's inappropriate in this setting. I suppose, touching quickly onto the next point, recognising that Loban Valley itself has a particular character in amongst the wider rural resource area, which I guess can be classified as at least distinctive or distinguished from other rural resource areas. It leads on to this notion of precedent, and I think precedent it's used quite a lot here in our district, and I think it's something that we just need to be mindful of relying heavily on. I suppose as a starting point, I mean, there's a planning regime to go through with any subdivision. The minute you're non-compliant, and the minute you hit that trigger of being under 2 hectares or under 8 hectares, you've got to go through this process of determining whether or not you're undermining near those values. If you're appropriate in those instances, if the subdivision is demonstrating effects to be suitably mitigated, then presumably the subdivision would be approved. Presumably the subdivision is appropriate in that particular context. So simply suggesting that this site here, simply suggesting that the existing built format's already there, simply suggesting that this particular layout doesn't automatically infer that subdivision elsewhere is entirely appropriate. I don't think you'd see many consultants come along and lodge an application that will simply say, hey, look, you've granted a non-compliant subdivision here, so it's entirely appropriate in this location. That's not the test. The test is to go through the assessment process and determine it's appropriate. So I don't necessarily think we'd be seeing a proliferation of subdivision of this nature elsewhere. But I think it's important, and I suppose the reason for Mr. Todd's involvement is that precedent being determined in this location already. A decision from the court has been provided, and that should provide some direction in terms of how we apply precedent. Certainly not purporting to be a legal expert by any means, but I wonder whether at this point in time, Mr. Todd, whether it's worth bringing you in to have a quick conversation around precedent for the benefit of the Commission.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm happy to do that, unless you want to deal with other issues with Mr. Woodward first, and then I can deal with this issue. I'm in your hands.
Yeah, I'll just check with the other panel members. Is there any questions of Mr. Woodward before we hear from Mr. Todd in relation to the relevance of the precedent arguments through the Harris CODC case?
Nothing from me.
Carry on, Mr. Todd. I think we'll pick up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you'll note from that decision, I appeared for the appellant before the Environment Court in 2015. That was a decision, just by way of quick background, where an application for a subdivision below the minimum lot size was being sought, and in part on the basis that there was an existing consent in place for a building to cater for travellers' accommodation. In that particular case, the building had not been constructed, which is the difference here, and it hadn't been consented. So again, a distinguishing part, because of course, as Jake has alerted you to, decisions have already been made in this particular case that the siting of the building, which is now sought to be used as a dwelling, have already taken into consideration impacts on amenity, impacts on open space, those types of matters. So that was a little bit different to that in terms of the Harris case. But it is important also to consider that the Harris decision was heard, and the appeal, was heard in 2015, the decision given in early 2016. I acknowledge there was a dissenting judgment by one of the commissioners in relation to the as against the majority, but of course the majority prevails in that particular case. And one of the issues around precedent is that an underlying fundamental aspect of justice is that like cases should be treated as with like, and that is the underlying issue that really guides the question of precedent. And whether precedent will occur from the granting of a consent. In my submission to you, there's no evidence before the commission, particularly from Ms. Ramsey's report, that there has been a floodgates of applications that have occurred since 2016 that would suggest that decision, the Harris decision, did have a precedent effect. That, in other words, there hasn't been a whole lot of people come before you saying, oh, we've got a consent for travellers' accommodation. Now we want to use it as a basis for subdivision. And that, of course, is not the situation here either. The Hankinsons have gone through for the evidence outlined in Mrs. Hankinson's evidence. There has been particular circumstances which have led to the various applications. And of course, nobody could have predicted when they sought the consent for travellers' accommodation what has occurred within our district and within nationally and internationally in the last 2 years in terms of COVID. And it's going to be a long time before travellers' accommodation gets back on its feet. And here we have a resource in the sense of an existing dwelling, which can be used for another purpose without any adverse effects, in my submission, and not being something that would be contrary to the objectives and policies of your plan, because your plan does not seek to direct you to avoid situation of subdivision which is below the minimum lot size. The policies direct you to look at the adverse effects being avoided, remedied, or mitigated. And again, I would draw your attention to commentary in that respect from Judge Jackson in the Harris decision, which was an important factor that he took into consideration. So that guides you in relation to the issues which Jake has referred to in terms of amenity, because those issues have already been determined in relation to this structure. So really the question for you today is, what is the difference of this structure being used for travellers' accommodation as distinct from it being used from residential? Given that in terms of the consent for travellers' accommodation, there is no limit on the extent of such use on a occupancy basis, they're entitled to use the property for 6 persons up to 365 days a year. So the question really is there going to be any difference in effect from the residential use to the visitor accommodation use? And I would suggest to you, in terms of potential impacts on amenity for the community and more particularly for immediate neighbours, it is highly likely that there's going to be less impact from the use on a residential perspective than there is from travellers' accommodation, where people often may have little respect for the amenity of neighbours, where they're much more likely to do so, putting aside the neighbours from hell scenario, they're more likely to have more respect for neighbours in terms of the amenity if they're there living as part of the community on a permanent basis. So those are my brief submissions, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being able to speak. I'm currently situated in Melbourne, and I apologise for not having the appropriate attire with me in terms of the example that the chairman is setting, as I normally might. But and I appreciate I've been asked just to speak on this particular issue, not run the hearing on behalf of the applicants.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Todd. I appreciate you are attending for some personal circumstances.
Thank you.
Please do not worry about the tie. I was tossing it up myself, and I thought I didn't last time, and I felt like I was not doing it properly, so I thought I should. But the only thing is you only see the top half, of course, don't you?
He's got he's in his PJs on the bottom half. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just checking with the panel, is there any particular questions anyone's got of Mr. Todd following what he's given us? It's a decision that we're reasonably well aware of. Yeah, thank you for those comments, Mr. Todd. Mr. Woodward, we'll go back to you, and if you've got anything else to carry on with before you pass over, then we might have some questions after you finish.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Mr. Todd and Chairman. Look, but those were the two main issues that have really cropped up in terms of Council's recommending report that I think needed to be addressed. I suppose the only other issues really relate to the conditions of consent that have been recommended, along with some unknowns about or a bit of a miscommunication around the natural hazard side of things. But I'm just wondering whether it's appropriate to be talking about the conditions now, or whether it's worth traversing the wider issue of the general subdivision at this point in time.
From your perspective, I'm happy for you to do both the wider issues and the conditions, and then that will at least mean, well, it's important you do that because it'll mean that when the planning consultant presents, she can pick up some of the issues that you may raise that she can cover off in her response as well. So I think that would be worth doing, and don't be surprised if we don't give you any particular questions about conditions at this stage. We'll probably hold off on them or not. Yeah. So
yeah, absolutely. Yep. No. Okay. Well, I suppose touching on the conditions themselves. So the starting point, or I guess the first point really, is that there's been a recommendation to impose a number of conditions as it relates to natural hazards. And so while our application as submitted didn't include any specialist evidence around flood levels or anything like that, I suppose the focus really in terms of submitting that application was recognising that all of the built form is existing. The subdivision back in 2019, which relate to the existing dwelling, was subject to consideration by ORC. ORC determined at that time that the site was subject to a low risk of any potential flooding. We've got advice from ORC which confirms that the creek that actually dissects the site is a tributary known as the Thomas Johnson, which for the most part runs dry during the summer periods of the year. Essentially a trickle, and upstream of that particular catchment, it's actually subject to a number of water takes to some of the landholding further up the stream. So I think the alluvial fan or the flooding issue primarily relate to the low burn itself, as opposed to what is effectively a small trickle of a creek running through the property. And so there wasn't necessarily any reason to suggest that there would be any concern from a flooding perspective. With that in mind, and I think this is with the reason for the administration conversation at the start of the process, I think Stantec, in reviewing the application, didn't necessarily appreciate the fact that all of those buildings are existing. And so we've got some conditions which requires a consent notice to be imposed on the title for lot 1, which includes the existing dwelling, and proposed lot 2, which includes the accommodation unit. But we've got a consent notice which requires us to determine minimum floor level, and essentially for a notice to be imposed on the title, which from my quick review of the surrounding properties doesn't appear on any other titles which are located in the same vicinity of each of these water bodies. But it requires consideration of natural hazard to be taken into account, and I think I don't necessarily see the need for a reference to be imposed on the title when you've got a district plan framework that highlight the site as natural hazards anyway. Someone wants to do something, they trigger a rule under the natural hazards rule or ORC, something similar. So I guess where I'm going with that is that I think it's not necessary to include any conditions around finished floor levels and so on. I mean, it's not like we're going to bowl the building and raise it. And then I guess the only other point to raise is that Ms. Ramsey has suggested a condition along the lines of landscaping. If the Commission were of a mind to grant the subdivision, that a degree of landscaping should be promoted to screen the building. Specifically, she's referring to the cottage. And I've got a question mark here. Again, we've talked about, or we've at least established the character of that area. The character of that area is a range of dwellings sporadically located throughout. Simply being able to see a dwelling or a building doesn't necessarily mean it's adverse. Touching on Mr. Todd's advice, the building has gone through that process already in terms of being appropriate in a setting. So I don't see the logic in terms of requiring extensive further landscaping to hide the building should consent be granted. So my submission to the panel is that yeah, any further landscaping is just not necessary. It's not going to achieve any purpose, at least from a resource management perspective. But look, aside from that, we've established the character of the area. We've established that the proposed building, the fact that it's not changing, and the fact that the occupancy is not necessarily changing. It's just going from 6 travellers accommodation to full-time residential. We've established that there isn't any material change in terms of effects on the receiving environment. We've established that the building is fully consented and serviced with the relevant code of compliance. We've established that there's no productive capacity for the site. We've established that in terms of precedent, there's been a direction provided by the court previously, which Mr. Todd has referred to. And we need to recognise that this proposal, it's not every day that you get over 40 odd submissions, including a vineyard operator who shares the boundary with the site supporting the proposal. As Mr. Todd pointed out, and as very detailed in Ms. Hankinson's report, the circumstances leading to this situation has brought us to where we are today. We've got a situation where they've gone through several years of consenting, which have resulted as a consequence of unforeseen circumstances. So I think for the Commission to consider that the use of that building for residential purposes is not appropriate wouldn't necessarily be conforming to the purpose of the RMA. I mean, it would be it seemed to me to be an entirely appropriate and sustainable use of a resource, a building that's sitting in an area that we've all seen unprecedented growth in the last several years. So it just seemed entirely appropriate to in this day and age to allow a family or professional trying to get into the area to at least occupy the building, where for now it's just sitting there uninhabited. That in of itself had the potential to detract from the neighbours' amenity values. So to me, I don't see any resource management issues as to why we should be going down this route. So that's pretty much the crux of it for the panel. So happy to take on any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Woodward. Yeah, and I'm sure that those issues you've raised in relation to consent conditions will be things that that the planning consultant will give us some guidance and some feedback on when she presents her report. I just clarify, who would you be? Will we go to the Hankinsons next, or just because they'll determine if I ask this question or not? That's all.
So we probably won't need to hear from our experts unless there's any specific questions, but whether the Hankinsons would like to just put in their 2 cents, I can't see them on the screen here, but whether they would like to just provide any perhaps, if it's for the benefit of the Commission, just some background as to how we got to where we are today. Would that be of benefit?
Yeah, let's just, okay, so if they're going to go next, then I'm going to ask the question that I've got of you, and you may or may not answer it. And if you don't, then they'll pick it up with when they talk to us. Which is what
Oh, yeah.
So before I do that, Stephen or Martin, have you got any questions of Mr. Woodward?
No, thank you.
Okay, so the question I've got is that in your application you talked about the cottage, because I'm pretty sure this panel was the one that actually did the consent for the subdivision in the first place. So we are aware of the background to that. And then because of the way that the council system works, when the travel accommodation was worked through, that was able to be done in delegated authority and not by the panel. So that part's was news to us. So my question really is, in terms of you referring the application to a change in circumstances that meant that the old cottage could not be removed. So I guess and then obviously further changes to do with COVID and those things and opportunities came along, and I get that. I just want to I'll leave the question hanging unless you want to answer it, but for the Hankinsons, when they do present their evidence, to pick up that issue and just sort of explain to me what that made it an issue that the cottage wasn't able to be removed, because I'm interested to understand that better.
Okay, so yeah, so sorry, Mr. Chairman. So the question is, what were the circumstances around why the cottage couldn't be removed? That's the question.
Yeah, because if I read your application correctly, you said there were some circumstances beyond their control that meant that couldn't be removed at the time as was planned, and it was put on a piece of derelict land effectively, and then from there, some opportunities arose with where the world went and whatever. So I get all that part from there, but I just trying to understand, say, well, what was those circumstances? So
okay, yeah, no, absolutely. I think I think probably what we might do is get perhaps the Hankinson to respond to that directly. Stephanie, I wonder whether you would like to come online and talk to that question.
Well, and they might as well, when they come online, is talk to not just that question, but actually give their evidences at the same time, summarise their evidence they've given us and pick it up as part of that. That's why I'm asking it now. So,
yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
Sorry, I was actually, can you all hear me?
Yep, good as gold, thank you.
Great. Look, so what happened was we obviously got that consent back in 2019, and then the cottage was surplus to requirement, and that was to be moved off site. So that was all agreed. And then unfortunately, due to the truck en route to our house, can you remember there was a truck accident just south of Dipton where 2 trucks were written off, head-on collision at Dipton with King's Removals? Yep. I was just looking for the photo. So the truck itself was written off the morning en route to our house. So unfortunately, Breens were set to go. We were already held up, and this house needed to be removed off-site. It had to go. And unfortunately, the only trailer that King's had at the time that could move it wasn't able to take it. They borrowed it in from Fortin and Hogan. They couldn't take it out onto the road. So we needed to quickly apply to David Campbell. I've got all the emails to David asking, quick, can we store it on site? And we obviously had the paddock down on the bottom that was unused. And at that stage, David gave us a 3-month literally parking consent for that cottage to go down the bottom. So I was looking for I've actually got a photo of the truck written off sitting just south of Dipton. And that was the catalyst for when the house got put down there. It was a case of, you know what could we? Is there an opportunity? And then further conversations with David and emails that potentially we could use it as visitor accommodation, and that it was actually advised to us that that would be the best option.
No, so what you've just told me is that it was all the result of an accident, and not as opposed.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
I'm looking for the photo to show you actually. Yeah, quite literally.
I'd expect if I asked that question, normally there would have been some other, dare I say, story that would explain as to why it became an opportunity. But your opportunity was born out of a true and absolute unquestionable accident. So appreciate that.
Yeah, we have got a spectacular photo of it actually.
That answers my question very satisfactorily. Thank you. So. Not important to see the photo, but if you've got it and you can show it to us, that would be good. But otherwise, I'd leave you to go over the rest of your evidence as you want to point things out to us, please.
Sure. So you'd like us to go over the evidence?
Yeah, so so we've got your written evidence, your 10-page evidence that you've given us, which we've read. So if you've got an opportunity now just to take us through that. And oh wow,
Can you?
Yep.
Truck been written off.
That's King's right there. King's
Yeah.
truck
wow.
en route to our house, and they were already 6 weeks late.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I wouldn't wish
So
that on
it's
anybody.
most unfortunate.
Thank you for clarifying.
So, and as I said, Breens were booked in and they needed to get that house out of sight because obviously the geotech reports needed to happen. The foundation people were all booked in, the builders were booked in, and things were starting to pile up. So therein lies that. So in terms of our evidence, we have had a really unusual run of family and personal circumstances. We are committed to Logan. We have built our own home here. We outgrew that initial home, as you would have heard and remember from the previous panel. We do have international family, and we also have New Zealand family here that are aging. And so, of course, Joth and I are it here. We don't have any family close by. And we, previous to COVID, Joth's parents used to actually come and visit 2 to 3 months a year, every year. And his other brother lives in the Waikato. So, of course, we were entertaining them. Things do get busy. The house does get full. It's come about by a really unusual circumstance with having the excess house, the accident, the bottom paddock, as so to speak. Now that's a piece of land that we've just not known what to do with for years. We've looked at different options. As Hugh Murray has said, that it's not productive. We can't grow vines on it. It's it's really, what can we use it for? That would be our question back to anyone on the panel as well. What would you propose we do with that land? So when it came up, we thought, great opportunity. And then unfortunately, COVID has hit. We have 2 young children, one who's just turned 4, who we cannot vaccinate. I don't feel comfortable and safe actually having a visitor accommodation in a pandemic environment. How do I service it, clean it, look after it safely with bringing it back to our house? Also, then from an economic point of view, it's actually not viable. And the other thing is, coupled with Joth's mother passing away and his father being turned down to actually come out to New Zealand, unfortunately. And so then, of course, it's a case of now, what do we do with this accommodation facility? Yeah. So that's in a nutshell. So of course we came to Jake in August last year and said, Jake, please come and visit us, go for a walk around the property, tell us what you think. Do we have a case? Is it worth putting in an application? And at that point, that was born the application, quite simply. Anything to add?
Okay. Thank you. Just was checking something about the neighbour and the previous consent. That's right. I've answered my own question. Martin, Stephen, any questions from you?
No, nothing from me.
Martin, sorry, I missed. Thank you.
Nothing from me.
Right, thank you. Give me just a moment. I'm just trying to find something that I'd read earlier that I was going to check to make sure that I now can say that I don't need to worry about that. Forgive me if you think I'm looking somewhere where it's not looking like I'm paying attention, but I'm looking at the other screen I've got. Yeah, okay. So I think between what you've said and what Jake, Mr. Woodward has said, is that we talk about this creek that's largely dry. Has anybody, or have you seen any evidence of what happened in particular with that creek during the 1999 flood? Has that come out anywhere? Has anybody during the different investigations you've done able to have seen what that creek did during 1999? I know it was a long time ago, and you guys were here.
Yeah, you get the photos. Yeah, I think we've touched on that, and I think Roger de Groot has obviously put his submission in to try and highlight the the risk involved with that 99 flood, which was obviously quite damaging. With the photos, you can see what it did. So there obviously is a concern there. But what we'd like to say there is that this clearly is from the Lowburn. It's not actually, the damage wasn't occurred from the Thomas Johnson that's coming through the property here. Yes, there is some water that comes down, but the extent of the damage was from the Lowburn, which is well below where we are now. But my issue here is that the double standard thing is where, you know, you've okayed a container, 40-foot house container down in that lower riverbed, but that hasn't been, you know, there's been nothing said about that. So really what I'm trying to say is that it should be highlighted. If there is a problem, it should be highlighted, but I believe there to be a problem with that. But that was only one submission.
Just to further from that, one of the previous owners of this property, Len Rigger, so he owned the property in the 1950s, 60s through to the 70s, and what he's done is he's actually wrote a book about Lowburn and what has happened, you know, with the various ownerships and floods and things over the years. So what in this book that Len Rigger has written, he's got a lot of historic photos and documentation of what has happened, and absolutely everything in here. Happy to photocopy this and email it or scan it. Basically shows all the damage coming through from the Lowburn. Yes, I believe that there, and Roger de Grua has pointed out that there's been a small amount of debris that was possibly built up already across Mr. Saunders' property that has come out over the paper road, which is Mr. de Grua's access. So that's where obviously an issue does lie for Mr. de Grua and obviously for Swan Road, but that's where it meets.
I think it's very difficult for us as well, because we you know, we've gone to every extent to try and help put a bit of confidence in the job for the neighbours, or if there's any worry of such. But I've contacted ORC. ORC have actually been on site. They've actually seen it. I've actually contacted the council about it, with the council water coming off Healy Road, and I've got videos to actually show that it's runoff water that's coming into that creek off the council road. So my thing to try and knock this off is that I cannot control what comes down that creek. It's not all up to me to control that. So I've got the evidence. I don't know what more I can do but hopefully that just clarifies that. There's also a 99, with regard to that 99 flood, I've also contacted the previous owner, Alan Martin, and he's got photographs sent to me with what happened, and there's also a write-up in exactly what happened to this property. So there was only some gravel debris that came in his driveway, but it went nowhere near the buildings.
Just the gateway.
So it was off the actual road, not from that creek.
But since then, the council actually came in and did some culvert work just above the property, so that would address any issues further. So that shouldn't happen again, touching wood.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, the reason for my smile is that culverts are wonderful until you get the event that was bigger or different than the last one. But I know what you're saying. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you for clarifying that. And you're right, that Len Rigger book is a very good history of Lowburn in the area around here and what's actually happened in the past. So no, that's that thing helpful. Thank you, because I just wanted to clarify the fact that, you know, the reference was that stream is dry, and the reality is that it's dry for as long as there's no water in it. And 1999, which will happen again one day. Let's hope it's a long way away. We'll put water back in it again, and what you've just indicated is that, to the best of your knowledge, that even with the 99 flood, the issues weren't significant. That's not to say, however, of course, that in the future that another flood of the same size couldn't have different impacts, and who knows.
What could we do?
Yeah.
And as Jake picked up on earlier, he mentioned that there's 4 properties above us that can turn that water out. So there could be more properties as well. So there's a big reservoir up at Donald Young's, and then there are 3 others that have the ability in a great flood event to actually turn water out as well.
Thank you. That clarifies that for me. I've got no other questions. Martin, Stephen?
Nothing.
Mr. Woodward, back to you. Where do you want to go next?
I think that probably, thanks for that background there to the Hinkinsons. I think that pretty much covers where we're sitting at this point in time. So I don't know where that noise is coming from.
I'm told that might be you making that noise. Yeah.
Look, I think we've largely presented where we're sitting at this point in time. Whether that gives the commissioners enough to be able to make a determination, I suppose we'll have to wait and hear from the council. So unless there's any other question, we'll sit tight and respond accordingly.
Cool. All right. So just let me then look and just do a double check. So from what I can see, the only submitter that we've got online is Mr. De Grue, and there are no other submitters online. Can I just clarify that, please? And the other submitters that indicated they might be appearing, I think, were ones in support. So there's nobody there in support. So on that basis, we'll now move into Mr. De Grue, as your submission. Do you want to speak to your submission, Roger, please?
Sorry, Roger, you need to unmute yourself.
How about now?
Yep, that's it.
Perfect.
You're unmuted. Yep, well done. Welcome.
Hello.
So we have got your submission, and in terms of the process, it was deemed to be late, but we have accepted it, so that's been resolved. So an opportunity to you now to speak to your submission and make any observations or comments you want to make sure that we're aware of, please.
I presume you have copies of the photographs as it's about?
Yes, we do. Yes.
I'm not suggesting that I'll speak to the water issue first. The stream has not dried up right through the summer, it's still running at the moment. So, but it is definitely a very quiet little trickle most of the time. It's just the 100-year flood events that concern me. I do not expect Joss to do anything about bringing the amount of water going down, but my concern is that the amount of fill he's put along the other side of the creek makes it vulnerable to erosion during one of these sudden thunderclap events. And that fill will be picked up if and when the downfall occurs. It'll go through Santa's property, go through my property, it will go across the road, possibly into the college on the other side. The damage that I've shown in the photographs is well away from the low burn. The low burn, the main damage that my property occurred on the opposite boundary. So those photographs are showing everything that's in those photographs came down to Thomas Johnson. It was because of Thomas Johnson being a side flood to the main event. It's things stay. It's only going to be a few years for me because I won't be able to stay in the much longer, in a couple of years. So it will be my issue, but somebody will one day have to deal with this as this event occur. I'd like to make a point about there being 44 submissions in favour. One of the supporters is less than a car trip away from the site. They want to see the result of the investigation of my view. They'll have to drive it. Not even within easy long distance. I don't think it could be any real weight given to the opinion of somebody who doesn't even live in Cromwell as to this being a wonderful idea. Prior to this college going up, I had a 100% rural view. Now, front and centre, I have a house. My concern is if this subdivision goes through, well, another one. Why should the owners of this, prospective purchasers of this college, not be able to say, oh, we don't want to use that land down in front of ours. We'll chop it up. If we go down to 1.8 hectares, we can go down to 600 hectares. Square meters, I should say. Just a creeping, unstoppable diminution of the values of what I see out of my background. I mentioned is the landscaping measures, I think, to the previous consent. You can see them on the Hankinson application. There's trees shown down in front of the house site. Now, it's been 2 years now, those plantings that have been done, nothing there. This is a question for me because Joss has done a lot of cleaning up, which he's entitled to do, but the removal of those big trees and all the growth between the two Peter Road and the former roads, to provide privacy, shade, and screening from wind. My property, now that it's all been stripped away. Right, I'm open to passenger traffic on the roads. The background is unusable during the summer because it's too hot. It used to be shaded, and wind comes howling through there and makes a most unpleasant place to be, as many as often is. Now, this hasn't been an intended result. Just one of those things that happened, but there's no effort to mitigate any of those consequences as I had mentioned them to Joss. And I thought that they would be covered in previous consents, but I just would like to think that at some stage that some of those plantings would be confirmed, and that we want to be the local consent monitor. I'm not quite sure who's the person to take them on. It's some of these things that I hope the part of the consents actually done. I think the summary of my submission in the written represents my view fairly, so I won't continue with the other points incessantly. I know there's nothing to be done about the building now, but I would just like maybe consideration be given to mitigate a bit of what I've lost. Just being able to have a house in the background of my best view. You have any questions for me? No.
Thank you, Roger. Just got a couple of questions, and I just would like to clarify the photographs that you've provided. If you can maybe give me just a quick, and for the benefit of the rest of the panel, of just where the photograph is taken in relation to either your house or to the Hankinson's house. In particular, the one I'm looking at is the one that shows the person in the red gumboots looking towards a white rough cast building and a blue, I don't know what sort of car it is. Can you give me some sort of indication as to where that photo is taken from and looking towards?
So they're looking at the photos will be taken from there's a terrace of the house that's runs around to the paper road at the western end. It would be Dr. Thomas Johnson at the point at which it enters my property, looking down towards the lower part of this section, the Lippenside Road, Heaver and Swan Road. I don't know You see my driveway coming through one of the photographs that's taken from a site elevated position. The other one was taken from the driveway itself. It was probably looking back up to the towards the Haggerton, looking towards Poser. And the so the low bin is kind of off behind the point of view up to the side.
Okay. What I might do, I might just show you my screen or present my screen so I can just make sure I've got the right photograph that we're talking about, just to make sure it's quite clear. So if you just bear with me, I think I have the technology to be able to do that.
Sorry, can I just get Mr. and Mrs. Hankinson to turn off your camera as well, please?
Is that photograph being presented on people's screens now? No.
No.
Just push that again and see if I can get it to work.
That's it, Neil. It's up
So
there.
that's
Yeah.
that should be up there now. So I guess yeah, just trying to pick where this photo is looking from and to. So that this is the particular photo I'm interested in. Roger, please.
There's a little stone rough cast cob cottage on the where London Valley Road and Swan Road meet.
Yeah.
There's a little cottage in there. So you're looking down the valley, across Swan Road. Kingy Road is off to the right of the photograph, and all that stuff down there on the left-hand side. That's all. It was Thomas Johnson. It's taken some days after the flood, so that's what's left over. If it was drained off. It's low burn is about 100 meters off to the left of that photograph. It's taken from top of the terrace that the house sits on. So it's pretty much where the Thomas Johnson's flowing at the moment. You can see it's gouged out quite a channel for itself. Those large lumps are rafts of earth and grass have been picked up and carried away by the floodwaters.
So just so I've got it. Okay. Yeah. So the background here, those hills that we're looking at, is that looking up Swan Road?
It's looking down towards the lake. That's Northbourne. Looking down to the Logan Valley towards the lake, towards the inlet. You can see a bit of the Logan in the far paddock.
Okay. Yeah. Right. I understand where you are now. Thank you. Any questions of Roger from the panel? Stephen, Martin?
Nothing from me.
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. de Groof. That's very helpful. Appreciate your presenting that to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
Just a final check, there are no other submitters online? Nope. So then I'd ask for our planning consultant to present your report, please, and any other questions you may have or clarifications you need to make on our behalf, please.
Hi, thank you. And thanks everyone for their time today. I'm just written down a few notes. I'm just going to run through that and speak to that. So if there's any questions, I can stop or just at the end. So I just reviewed the evidence that was filed by the applicant and their agent, and I also listened to what we've heard today. And my reply is just based on planning evidence only, and I note that the technical evidence provided by the applicant in terms of landscape I have not reviewed that or had that technically reviewed by a landscape architect, and I'm only responding from a planning perspective on that. Similarly, in terms of the legal evidence that was provided or the legal information by Mr. Todd, I've only had a chance only came through yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to read through that decision in full and understand that in its entirety for today's discussion. But I briefly looked at it. In terms of what I'd like to cover is I'll probably just respond to Mr. Woodward's comments in regards to the residential character and residential amenity. I'll also just add some notes in regards to hazards from what I've heard today, and also upon further review of the evidence provided, as well as work through the reverse sensitivity, productive capacity, and some short thoughts on precedent, where that may have changed from my previous discussion or from my report. In terms of the residential character and residential amenity raised in Mr. Woodward's evidence, I agree that a residential and travellers accommodation is treated with the same assessment matters under the plan. However, one thing I'd like to highlight is the plan also within that same rule restricts the number of residential activities that could occur on the site. And if this was considered sort of a residential activity at that time, then it would have actually elevated the consent up to a discretionary application. And in my view, the travellers accommodation actually doesn't trigger any density, so it is treated different to residential under that rule and under the plan. So where the property is proposed to be subdivided and the use changed, there would be sort of full discretion to assess that if it was just a land use for 2 residential occurring on the site. Therefore, I sort of maintain my view that this quite different and distinct activities. Residential is different to the accommodation activity, and we should look at that differently. However, in making my initial recommendation, I did not have the technical landscape assessment in regard to the rural amenity, and I make note that the residential amenity and residential character, as I've noted in my report, are separate matters, and I concur that the effects on amenity would not be adverse from the proposed change in use to travellers accommodation, as we've heard today. I agree from a rural amenity perspective that these are similar, but I still note my section 42 where we do get this additional domestication of the site, and that is something that is can be distinctly different to the accommodation activity. So just to summarise, I do concur with that technical evidence that was provided by the applicant, and that the effects on rural amenity from the change in use to residential can be treated as similar in this instance, particularly given that the existing landscape plan approved. However, in order to ensure any landscape effects are addressed as recommended in that technical evidence that was an important factor, I would note that those landscaping conditions I've recommended are important to manage the landscape mitigation moving forward if the panel were of mind to grant the consent. And that's particularly relevant if the travellers accommodation consent was surrendered and that landscaping plan or requirement was no longer required. I think it's important that those conditions are pulled down and placed on this consent. And I think the conditions are sufficient that based on technical inputs, it may not need any further landscaping, but it would ensure that those landscaping are maintained in perpetuity with a residential activity and not just linked to a travellers accommodation activity. In terms of reverse sensitivity, I note the evidence provided today in regards to addressing the reverse sensitivity and maintain my position from my section 42 that, well, it was provided in the evidence that that we maintain the appropriately sized allotments is an important tool that we have to address the issues of reverse sensitivity, but it's not the only tool. But in setting minimum allotment sizes and maximum in the rural zone, it enables, particularly if other allotments were further to be developed into productive uses, ensure the ability for those uses to establish as they are permitted by the plan and not further constrain those. And I'd ask the panel to consider if the existing legal mechanisms are sufficient to address these concerns. In respect of hazards, whilst there still appears to be a little bit of confusion over the hazard risk associated with the waterways on site, I have had a review of the ORC natural hazards database and note that the site is located within a recently active alluvial fan within the natural hazard database, and that the issues raised by submitters with developing activities on site. The issues that have been raised by submitters associated with developing activities on site and exacerbating those risks, whilst we don't have any technical expertise to confirm if this is true in this instance, I believe that those recommended conditions of consent would ensure that any future development on any allotment does actually take into account the potential hazard risk and will ensure that there are suitable controls in place to manage that risk, should a suitably qualified person determine those that actually be necessary for the proposed activity. And further to Mr. Woodward's comments, I note that I'm not sure if there are any conditions on similar titles in the area, but note that the site topography within the valley environment and noting on the ORC natural hazards database, not every site shares the same as within the same part of the fan area. So we can treat these sites as distinctly different. I'm also not sure if there's any evidence from ORC during flood events of flood history specific to the site. But I know upon request from ORC, they could potentially provide further details and have any information to corroborate what's been discussed today. So just to confirm and reiterate there, I think the conditions proposed are not overly onerous, and it highlights that there would be a change in use of the buildings on site and potentially increasing that risk of hazard to the site, especially when we go from travellers accommodation to residential. Travellers accommodation, you could just leave the site and not have, if there's a flood event, you don't have to remain on site, whereas residential, there's a more permanent basis associated with that. So I do think it's still important that we consider that. In terms of precedent, productive use and precedent, I'd just like to highlight the application as a non-complying as a result of the subdivision not meeting both the average and minimum required allotments of the size. I consider that the present levels of productive capabilities will be further reduced upon subdivision given the additional legal ownership, and I do not consider that the same productive capabilities will be maintained. So I don't consider that the lack of productive value is justification for further intensification of a site in the rural resource area, and I have concerns that this could open up a whole of the rural area to intensive use. I don't agree that the lack of productive value is conducive to the proposal having acceptable effects on the environment, and I maintain my concerns of this proposal setting a precedent for similar developments within the location and the wider district. However, in the light of discussions today, I understand that, I did just want to comment on, in terms of the discussions around precedent and my brief look at the Environment Court case. I note that whilst it's been noted that that was different because the building hadn't been constructed, I still understand that the consent was live at that time and it still formed part of that consented environment, which must be considered in terms of the environment that existed. So, and I guess that raises a concern in terms of precedent if we could see applications where they don't have to construct the building or it being constructed still going through that same pathway. I understand the concern that, you know, is this going to set a floodgate to be opened? Are we seeing pressure for this type of development occurring where we're going through a traveller's accommodation and through to a residential activity and justifying that for subdivision? I've had a look at the CODC system and I'm not well versed in accessing all the data within that system. But I have had a look and note there was about 50 applications for travellers accommodation between the period of 2019 to 2021, with approximately 15 of them in the rural resource area. But I could not find any evidence that these have been then further subdivided, and I would suggest that we'd have to look into that further to see if that is an issue that's occurring within the district. And I also just like to note that the travellers accommodation was sought during early to mid 2020, which was in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've concluded in my section 42A report on various factors that the effects of the proposal will be adverse, particularly in regard to rural character, amenity, productive values and reverse sensitivity. Upon receiving and listening to further evidence, I do maintain my position that the proposal will result in an intensive subdivision and land use that could set a precedent and has the potential to compromise the intent of the plan. So in summary, whilst I consider some of the concerns that have been raised on some aspects of the application have actually been addressed by the application and the evidence provided, my recommendation to the panel remains unchanged, based on the basis of precedent effects and plan integrity.
Thank you, Morgan. That's very helpful and very thorough. And somehow Eric going on. Don't think that's it. Let me just check. Right, hopefully that fixed that problem. Yeah, it might have been something at my end. I was fiddling with two different lots of speakers and I may have turned both of them on. So sorry about that. Thank you, Morgan. That very helpful. I don't have any particular questions. I had one, but you clarified it at the very end for me. Thank you. Panel, Stephen.
Nothing from me.
Martin.
Nothing from me, thank you.
Cool, thank you. So that now puts us back to the applicant and the opportunity for a right of reply. Now, Mr. Woodward, I guess it's been a bit covered. You've heard some responses from the planning consultant. I don't know that there's anything necessarily outstanding here. There might be an issue around the flood-related issues going forward. But anyway, for you now to give your right of reply. However, if there's anything you think that you aren't able to address appropriately today, then certainly happy to consider that being done at a later date in writing if you so wish. But I'll leave that in your court now to think about. Equally, if you want some time to talk to your clients offline before you do the right of reply verbally, then I'm happy to allow that as well. But yeah, up to your call.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Commissioner. Thanks for that, Mr. Ramsey. Look, if we could have a couple of minutes, what I'll do is I'll just contact the clients, the Hankinsons and Mr. Todd, just have a quick conversation if that's all right, about 10 minutes. Would that be okay?
Right, so according to my watch, it's now 12:38. So let's say we resume 10 minutes will become 15. So I'm going to say 12:55. How does that sound?
We'll come back online at 12:55, eh?
Yep. Happy with that, Nicole? That works from your end, no issues?
Absolutely, no worries.
All right, so people are happy just to wander away, stay connected, and the applicant will talk offline, and we'll resume this hearing at 12:55 with the right of reply from the applicant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. De Groot, are you able to turn off your camera? Thank you. And Martin, you can turn yours off too.
Just doing that, I consider myself told off.
Righto, sorry about that. I'm just about running late. I got distracted on something else to do with another job I have. Nicole, are we all set to resume? No issues from your point of view?
Nope, all good here.
Right, thank you. Mr. Woodward, we're in your hands as to where you want to take us next.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, you're right. Quite a few matters have been raised over the course of the hearing. I suppose just trying to keep it brief and concise. The key issue that I think has really come out of this whole conversation is around this natural hazards conversation. If I'm being honest, I had a bit of trouble trying to understand, I guess, the nature of the photos that Mr. de Grauwe was trying to confirm. Just talking with the Hankinsons, the photo of the cottage was taken from the paper road, looking, I guess, toward the Lowburn settlement. But certainly that flooding doesn't in any way, shape or form suggest that the subject site is subject to some form of flooding. The buildings themselves on both proposed lots 1 and 2 are in existence. They are there today. They have been subject to 2, maybe 3 previous resource consenting processes where they've been subject to notification. ORC was specifically involved in the 2019 subdivision. They've been to the site. They've considered the site. They've considered the Thomas Johnson. They've advised the fact that the Thomas Johnson runs dry. The Thomas Johnson is effectively, for want of a better term, a bywash of the upstream catchment irrigation infrastructure. It's not the Lowburn Creek, which is some distance away and at a lower elevation from the subject site, of which there are existing residential development that sits between the subject site and the Lowburn Creek itself. I guess it is relevant to recognise that ORC once again had an opportunity to consider this application as well. No concerns have been raised. I think that this whole idea of the building being subject to some degree of risk just by changing the type of occupancy, my short response to all of that to the panel was the risk is existing and the buildings are existing. No changes are being promoted whatsoever. Touching on some of the planning matters that's been raised by myself, by Ms. Ramsey, I suppose the first point that I just want to confirm is in terms of the landscaping condition. Ms. Ramsey might need to correct me if I've misinterpreted, but from what I hear, and this is where I would agree with Ms. Ramsey, is that it makes sense that if you are to that the landscaping that was imposed as part of the travellers' accommodation formed a condition of consent, and so should the travellers' accommodation disappear, the question around, well, should the landscaping remain, becomes questionable, sort of thing. I think it's reasonable that if consent is granted, the landscaping that appears today, the landscaping that forms part of the receiving environment, the landscaping that was considered necessary to mitigate effects associated with the original cottage that went through this very similar process, I think it's reasonable to require that landscaping to be maintained. That may be structured in a condition of consent one way or another, but any further landscaping over and above that, I think myself and Ms. Ramsey are on the same page that we don't need to provide any further landscaping. That's what I picked up on, but once again, I'll just remind the panel that the built form is existing and it was determined as being entirely appropriate in that location. What further land, what resource management purpose will we achieve by hiding that particular structure? No other building down that road is hidden away. I suppose I don't think it's worth repeating I guess my position in terms of the appropriateness of the subdivision, which is at odds with that of Ms. Ramsey. The commission need to be aware that the minimum allotment size is not the only tool. You're aware of it. It is simply the district plan itself. I only need to direct you to section 6.4 of my evidence. 6.4 of my evidence, I point out the fact that the district plan specifically says it specifically says that council's duty under the RMA is to control the effects of activities. The creation of a new allotment on a plan in itself has no real direct effect on the environment. However, the control of subdivision, particularly in respect of minimum and average allotment sizes, is a tool which will assist in controlling the adverse effects that follows, thereby promoting sustainable management. Minimum allotment sizes for subdivision are not considered to be the best practical methods to control adverse effects. So let me just repeat that. Minimum allotment sizes for subdivision are considered to be the best practical method to control adverse effects. However, in some instances, adherence to an arbitrary minimum is not always the most appropriate approach. This is particularly true when subdivision for existing activities, network utilities, reserves, and so on are being considered. It is not the only tool, it is one of a number of tools. And as I mentioned, the rural resource area covers a significant proportion of our district. Within the rural resource area, there is a significant variability in terms of land use, in terms of land types, in terms of the ability to absorb further development. This particular site has been determined, at least in my assessment, and through the evidence that you've been provided, you've only got one landscape evidence to suggest that the landscape consisted of built form on the valley floor. The upper reaches of the Lothian Valley are devoid of built form, and rightly so. The upper reaches are subject to landscape classification. The valley floor isn't. You've got a situation where you've got existing built form which can be integrated into the receiving environment that will not undermine landscape values, that will not undermine visual amenity values. Again, it's been considered and consented as being appropriate. We've determined from an agronomist that the site has no real productive capacity, so I don't understand how we would be increasing or compromising productive capacity any further. We don't have access to any irrigation water, which is a separate process in and of itself. Yes, we have submission from our neighbours. Some of those submissions are in support, some of those submissions are in opposition. The most important submission I think that we've received to date is that of Aotearoa Wines, which are the adjacent productive operator here. They have provided their support to the application. In fact, they provided their support to the previous application. The property to the south, on the opposite side of the road, is another important productive operator, and that's owned by Perrin Wines. They have not submitted on the proposal. The Hankinsons have advised that they've spoken to Mr. Perrin, and he's aware of the subdivision. In fact, he went as far as to suggest that, when is it going to go on the market? The submission from the other submitters, they raise a range of matters. They raise a number of issues. In all my experience, it's always been the other way around. Travellers' accommodation is always the thing that trips us up. It's hard to get a travellers' accommodation consent from residential. Here we've got a situation where we're simply trying to utilise an existing resource in an area that is entirely appropriate, that is characterised by residential, and we're getting pushback. It doesn't make sense. We just have to take ourselves back to the purpose of the RMA, and it's sustainable management. Are we suggesting that this building, which is in place, again, it's been determined under previous consenting applications as appropriate, that is completely serviced to council standards, which is subject to code of compliance? Are we suggesting that converting that use, which is allowed to be operated 365 days a year for up to 6 people who might be disruptive, there's no management plan in place for that previous consent? Are we suggesting that it's not an appropriate use for that particular building for residential, next to their residential neighbours, in an area where the operator isn't overly concerned? I think denying this application doesn't represent sustainable management. I don't think you're going to see an issue very similar to this going forward. I've never had this myself. That's not to say that I see every application, that's the council's position, but it took me a long time to look at this one and come to the conclusion that actually at the end of the day, it is quite unique, the circumstances that have brought us to where we are today. So ultimately, the decision lies with the commissioners. Unfortunately, myself and Ms. Ramsey are not on the same page, so we can't direct you to a joint consideration. So the panel will have to determine whether or not the granting of this application gives effect to the purpose and the objectives of the district plan, relying on the evidence that you had before you. So that's where we sit today. We have no further information to provide at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Woodward. So I clarify one particular aspect of that.
Yeah.
Are you effectively contending that because of what's already been authorised by previous consenting processes, this application doesn't give the opportunity to revisit anything that wasn't put in place during those, as part of those processes?
Well, the council have got full discretion. The panel have got full discretion for any application that's discretionary or non-compliant, which is what we have in front of us. So you can consider anything and everything. I guess we're in a situation at the moment where we're debating matters that have already been previously assessed and considered. It's not an efficient use of resources and time and cost. You can consider previous applications. You can reconsider, I guess, not previous decisions, but I guess the previous chain of thinking. What I'm trying to convey to the panel is that we've got a situation where everything has been, it's gone through the channels, it's gone through a process of consideration and consenting to ultimately be granted. Ms. Rand is correct in that the rule framework talks about one dwelling per site. If you have a second residential dwelling, it will bump up the activity criteria to a discretionary regime, and therefore the commissioners at the time, if they were considering 2 dwellings, would have had a much wider scope. But I looked at those assessment matters very closely prior to this hearing, and the assessment matters that are to be considered for travellers' accommodation or 1 dwelling are largely consistent with that of a discretionary subdivision. It covers all of those key matters in terms of landscape values, productive values, natural hazards, servicing. All of those matters form part of the restricted discretionary regime. So yeah, I get that the activity status will change, but ultimately the matters are largely consistent. I don't think there's any need to go back and revisit those previous consents unless there's something that's fundamentally a flaw in that previous consideration.
So why do you, of the view that nothing gives rise to the need to do that? There is nothing to stop that from actually happening. This panel may take the view that the consent for the travellers' accommodation and the matters it considered and how it considered them may take a different view about those, and they would be allowed and right to do that.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. So without saying that the travellers' accommodation decision is right or wrong, this panel may look at that and with what else it's done and come to a different view, because what was relevant and known and understood when that was done is not the same as what it is today.
That's correct. In saying that, that decision can't be revoked, the travellers' accommodation. So you may have a different opinion on the conclusion that was met in that decision. That decision can't be revoked. That decision remains.
Yep.
I suppose in considering that further though, Commissioner, again, fundamentally, are we generating any tangible change? Is there going to be a material change in effects? Someone that turned left down off the state highway down Leyburn Valley comes into a very distinctive settlement, a residential settlement. As they travel down that road, they will head into what is effectively a peri-rural environment that is subject to residential activities. I guess my question is, the rule framework is in place to protect rural amenity values. Are we compromising rural amenity values with the subdivision? Is someone driving past that site, recognising the existing built form, the landscaping and everything that surrounds it? Are they going to give you a call and say, Ashley, you've just undermined my appreciation of the site? I don't think that'll happen. So certainly you had the opportunity to have a different view on the previous applications, but just want to remind the panel that what are the changes here?
Yeah, our view on the previous, approach, the view on the previous application is irrelevant. It's not the view on the previous application, it's the view on the current application. And what I'm just making sure is that from you, that you don't disagree, is that if we have a view that's different than what's been adopted previously, then that view is perfectly entitled to be held.
Correct.
But as you rightly point out, that doesn't take away what's already been approved. So I understand
Correct.
that. Right. Just one thing I just want to clarify, because and it came up during the evidence as well with the creek. And if I go back to the application document, the aerial photography that was used in that the Charlie Hughes and Associate plan from 19th of July 2021 was showing some old aerial photography, whereas the modern photography and the fact on the land shows now a very incised, well, not incised, sorry, a very clear channel for the creek to flow through. And I guess if I am right, that has been a result of the material that was brought in and where the land either side of the water course was effectively raised.
I think in order to get the accurate answer, I need to revert to Joth. Joth, can you give us a very concise response to that, please?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think with regard to that, it's just to clarify that I understand what you're saying. Yes, there was some fill brought in, but the ORC actually have been on site and seen that. Yep. And they said that there was no where there would be a problem is that if I changed the direction of the flow of the creek or tried to block the water and make a reservoir, that's when the ORC or contaminated that water in any way, that's when the ORC would have to kick in. Whereas in this circumstance, let's just get it straight that there's been no diversion of the creek at all, but there has been that fill brought in to raising levels to get that level, but there's been no change.
Yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting that there was. I just want to make sure that when you look at the aerial photography now and drive past, it's quite clear is that what you've made sure now is that the channel of the stream is confined to not be an overland channel when the flows are high, but within a very confined channel. You did that outside of the waterway, so no issue about that. Just want to make sure that it's quite clear that that my summation of that is actually correct.
Yeah, and I think with again, when we first arrived here nearly 9 years ago now, that place was full of weed and poplars and slash that probably did arrive down on that fence line.
Which is through another fence.
Yeah, so I mean that's probably where it was, but that's since been cleaned out, and I think from your site visit you'll see that it is clean and it's got a clear channel for it to flow with no debris in it.
What you've clarified what I thought from what I have observed, so I understand that. The other thing that just while I've got you, I just want to pick up on this about the flow in that channel is that it dries up sometimes during the summer. Otherwise, the flow is really quite small, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean that's as we've stated before. It is an irrigation. We haven't got a take on it for properties above us. The Te Amo Station, Pack Spur, they've all got water takes on it. So when they're all taking water from it, it can run dry and it can be turned off like a tap. So therefore, that's what I'm trying to say. We cannot really control what comes down that creek. But it is a trickle, and once again, there is water flow coming off Heaney Road as well. So I can't control the colour of the water either, because in high rainfall, yes, it does get a bit more with the colour. It goes a bit browner because it's come off the Heaney Road gravel.
No, cool. No, that clarifies that issue for me. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks, Mr. Woodber, for letting me just clarify that to make sure I understood just those are the clear differences, because it's quite marked when you look at the aerial photography. That's all.
Yeah.
Right. That was the only thing I wanted to clarify with you. Only things I wanted to clarify. And I'll just check with Stephen and Martin if there's any questions from them.
No, I'm fine, thanks.
I might just flick over to Morgan. Anything we need to know that we have missed out of that? We'll write a reply, Morgan, sorry.
No, I think that's pretty much covered it. Thank you.
Cool. And just go to our planning staff, Anne and team, no issues that I need to pick up on.
No, I'm good. Neil, thanks.
Rightio. Unless there's nothing else to add, Mr. Woodward, on that basis, I'll advise that the decision of the hearings panel is reserved. The formal decision will be in writing and available within the statutory period of 15 working days. In the event that the release of the decision is delayed, the applicant will be advised of the delay. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your cooperation and assistance today to get us through to where we are and in a framework that we don't normally use. Yeah, appreciate everybody's cooperation in making it happen. So thank you. We will
Thanks for your
now
consideration. Cheers.
we'll now move panel to public excluded.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We can all leave. Martin, Stephen, we'll go to the other call we have for that.
Cool. See you there.